You're listening to episode 252 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. J. Forrest returns to talk about his new book, Secular Buddhism, An Introduction. There are many books out today that are touching on a secular approach to the tradition. Some are very pragmatic and deeply rooted in practice. Others are more scholarly conjecture. But few have taken the step of using the term secular Buddhism explicitly in the title. J. N. Forrest is a secular Buddhist who teaches weekly on the popular 5 Minutes Dharma podcast. He's a certified meditation teacher with Aura Wellness Center, has studied a Christian form of Zen with Brian C. Taylor, a former rector at St. Michael's and All Angels Episcopal Church, and insight meditation with Sally Armstrong, a teacher at Spirit Rock Meditation Center. Jay's background and education is in Christianity. He became a born-again Christian in 1983, and soon after he felt the call to the ministry. He did his undergraduate work at Central Bible College and Berrien University, and holds a doctorate of ministry from Trinity Evangelical Christian University. He also received an honorary doctorate of divinity in 1999. So sit back, relax, and have a nice honey lime tea. Our guest today returning to the podcast is Jay Forrest. Jay, welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Very glad to have you here. As a reminder to the listeners, Jay was last with us in episode 236, Pentecostal Preacher to Secular Buddhists. So if you'd like to find out more about Jay and hear him talk about his background, you can tune into that episode. But today we're here to talk about something else. And I also wanted to briefly mention that Jay has joined the SBA, taking over technical support for Dana Nuri. So we're very glad to have him here. He's also helping us out with present moment mindfulness practice and science. So Jay, deep gratitude towards you for that.
It's my pleasure.
And today we're here to talk about your new book, Secular Buddhism, An Introduction. I'm very grateful to see this because it's a book that has secular Buddhism explicitly in the title, which a lot of folks don't have yet. This is one of the first, so I'm very glad to see that. So what made you decide to publish this new book?
Well, I've been writing on my blog for some time about secular Buddhism. I also, on my podcast, have talked about secular Buddhism a number of times. And I really felt that there was just a short introduction to what is secular Buddhism? What are some of the issues that people might be interested in exploring secular Buddhism? Why is that even, a term? And so it starts with kind of my own personal odyssey through, becoming a Buddhist and finding out some of the more detailed information about what traditional Buddhism and what the Pali Canon says about Buddhism. And my own struggles with how does that fit with what we know from science and from nature and from the things that we've learned from cosmology and things like this. How do you mix the two? How do the two coincide? And so during the writing and podcasting, I've dealt with the subject a number of times. So what I did is I basically incorporated both the stuff I did in the podcast and my blog entries, edited those and put them into a book. Plus I did an extra chapter that's specifically written just for this book that deals with more where secular Buddhism came up from, the very beginnings of it. I tried to trace back as far as I can back into the history of it.
Yeah, so you made some very good references in here in a number of spots, and even some places that aren't available anymore. I see some references here just in looking at the book. And you do go back fairly far. And it's just an interesting, as you said, it's a short and approachable background on what crafted and what led to this formation of a secular Buddhism. So in the book itself, what's your favorite part? What's your favorite story in here?
That's hard to pick a favorite story, just because there's so much in here that, I share my own personal, story, which of course has meaning to me, being the person who went through it. I guess chapter 6 is actually probably my favorite, just because I didn't know. I've talked to both Stephen Batchelor and yourself, and I've interviewed both of you on my podcast. And in that, you credit Stephen Batchelor and Stephen Batchelor credits you, which is kind of interesting. And so I was like, well, where did the term secular Buddhism come from? And in it, I researched Google Scholar, and I found that it was actually used in the 80s, but not in the sense that we use it today. It wasn't until 2000 that Jeremy Holmes was the first to actually use the term in the sense that we mean it now. In it, he said, I start with a credo, one which tries to balance psychodynamics with a kind of secular Buddhism, which I believe is compatible with the values of psychotherapy. And that's clearly speaking of secular Buddhism as we refer to it now. And so that really was the first reference I was able to find. I'm not saying that it's the first time it was used in that sense, but that was the only one that I was able to find on the internet or through Google Scholar.
Well, so what about another one? What's if you have a few in here that you like, what else would you like to share with the listeners?
Well, as you struggle with labels, and this is something that all of us deal with, whether we came back. Myself, I came from a Christian background, Pentecostal Christian. And so, you call yourself a Christian, and in some circles, you'd call yourself a Pentecostal Christian. But what if you're a Buddhist, but you don't necessarily believe in reincarnation? What do you call yourself? And so I looked around, and that's when I found secular Buddhism. And it combines something up to date, dealing with the way science and our understanding of the universe is, with Buddhism, which to me, I still believe the Buddha was the greatest psychologist that ever lived. The insight he had to the human mind and the human condition, by far, one single man having that much insight is incredible. And for me, I'm a follower of the Buddha. But it's also struggling with, but if you're a Buddhist, shouldn't you follow all of the Buddhist teaching? And so it was that struggle. And we talked about that in the previous podcast I was on. How do you define yourself? If you're a Buddhist, then do you have to be in the Buddhist box? And that's always the difficulty with labels. So when what are you? Well, I'm a naturalist. You could call me a religious naturalist, but I'm also a humanist, but a spiritual humanist. But I'm also a Buddhist, but a secular Buddhist. And you could also say I was a Taoist, but a philosophical Taoist. In each case of those four traditions, there's something modifying it. Because and this is what Stephen Batchelor said when I interviewed him, is we're groping for terminology, for what's becoming and evolving with the Dharma becoming part of the West, and our understanding of more spiritual traditions and our own, Western tradition. We really haven't, until recently really began to study the Stoics and some of the great philosophy that was in Western society. And you'll find the Stoics in some ways very similar to Buddhist ideas. And so one of the things that I liked that I came upon is the title Zen Humanism. That kind of gives a tongue-in-cheek thing saying, there's this thing on the one side where we're scientific, we're rational, we follow, the scientific and rational naturalistic mentality. But there's also a part of us, a subjective part, if you use the term spiritual part even, there's a part of us that is beyond, we're not just what we think. And that's where Zen comes in. Zen is really an ambiguous word in itself and used and misused in so many different ways. But Zen is something more of an experience than it is a thing. It's not, I know originally it meant meditation, but when Zen teachers use it, they use Zen in that experience. If you know what Zen is, you don't say. If you say what Zen is, you don't know what it is. It's one of those, which of course comes from Taoism. And so when you take those two things, that rational, intellectual, and then the subjective, emotional, and you put them together, that's the struggle we're dealing with in the West, is how do you take those two things and marry them? Secular Buddhism is one way to do that, and I think a very legitimate and appropriate way to do that. And I want people to know about that. I want people to know that there is a way to be a Buddhist, but to also be rational and scientific. And secular Buddhism is one of those ways, not the only way. I'm sure there's other combinations and other words that people would use. And I don't try to get too caught up on labels. But I think secular Buddhism is an awesome way for people to marry those two things.
Yeah, it's interesting, Gus, getting caught up in labels and how we identify things when really this is just casting a wide net about an idea and how we might approach the Dharma. And it's interesting that what we do with secular Buddhism for many people, and what I have heard, and maybe you, Jay, have heard this as well, is that we're giving permission for people to be okay with doing this practice and not having to accept whole cloth things that may not work so well for them. We're not saying that we're avoiding the hard parts where real transformation takes place. It's not that. There is that human tendency, of course, but being aware of that, it's the things that are really not a part of our culture. It's not a part of our upbringing. And so some of the concepts that are included in various traditional formats, although they work well for many people, in fact, they're an attractor for many. It was initially for me with Zen. It doesn't always stay that way in the long run if that's an initial attractor, or it may be something of a stumbling block for people to approach it. So just this idea that we're promoting people's approaching what this might be like and what it might mean in their lives is one of the most rewarding things about working with secular Buddhism. Have you run into that at all yourself?
I have. I think that a lot of people believe that if you're going to be Buddhist, you have to be a certain kind of Buddhist. But the difficulty with that is which kind? I mean, Buddhism has always evolved. It's always changed. And there is, and I found this whenever I do a blog post on secular Buddhism, invariably I'll have someone say, well, you're not a Buddhist.
Yeah, we get
it's like, well, how do you figure what is and isn't a Buddhist? Because I reject rebirth, I'm not a Buddhist. Well, then Zen Master Dogen isn't a Buddhist because he rejected rebirth. So Zen to me is more radical in its rejection. It was a new form of Buddhism. It evolved in the culture of China and then was transmitted to Japan. And the changes it went through just from going from India to China to Japan was incredible how it changed. Because that's what I believe the Buddha created the Dharma to do, to meet people where they were, not to conform what was. Of all the things the Buddha he wasn't a dogmatist. He was a pragmatist. What works was what mattered. He was looking for the transformation of the human mind. And the transformation of the human mind has to be within the context that mind grows up in, the culture, the society, the rituals, the customs, the ideology. It has to be in that way. That's how it's always been. That's why every single culture that's had Buddhism come into it has changed the Dharma to fit that culture, because the Dharma was created that way. I believe that if you look at the Four Noble Truths or the Four Tasks or the Four Wise Beliefs, if you look at those are very malleable principles that apply differently in every situation that you go through. And it's going to apply differently in the context of your society. Suffering for somebody in Africa is going to be different than suffering somebody in the United States. It's not going to be the same, but the principles stay the same. There still is release from that suffering, from that dukkha. And that's the message of the Buddha and the Eightfold Noble Path. It's transcultural. It's beyond culture. So the things that the Buddha said were the rock solid things of Buddhism are able to leave one culture, go into another culture, and be completely applied in that culture. It's not culturally dependent. That's why, from my understanding, Buddhism was the first universal religion, the first religion that actually could leave a culture and be transplanted in another culture, at least the oldest that I know of. And so that's when I see that, to me, that's one of the great things about the Dharma.
So, Jay, in your own journey with secular Buddhism, what's been the most difficult aspect of it for you personally?
It's actually, believe it or not, it's the label.
I know, I believe it.
And I know you've had people on who've actually expressed similar, they follow the Buddha Dharma, but they're not Buddhist. They won't even call themselves secular Buddhist, because the idea of being in the Buddhist, if you're Buddhist, you're in the Buddhist box, you have to follow the Buddha Dharma. I don't have problems following the Buddha Dharma. That was never the difficulty. The difficulty is just the complete backlash that I've gotten for calling myself a Buddhist. And I got to thinking to myself, the Buddhism that we have in the West is not the Buddhism that was in Japan. It's not the Buddhism that was in China. It's not the Buddhism that was in India or Korea or any of those. It's an American Buddhism. And it was molded and shaped that way by the original people who brought it here. And the people who brought it here were traditional Buddhists. They specifically spun it to be a scientific Buddhism. And they did it because of the Christianity. They were trying to go into a field where Christianity was dominant, and they sold Buddhism as the scientific religion. And the thing is, those things that they said were scientific are in the Dharma. The Buddha did say, don't believe everything just because it's written in your religious text. The Buddha did say that you should treat the Dharma like a raft. You use it to get over the river of suffering, and once you're on the other side, you leave the raft. Don't be attached to the raft. Don't be attached to the Dharma. So all those things were there, but also the thing is, when I began studying it, I began reading the Pali Canon, beginning with the long discourses and then the middle discourses. There's a lot of supernaturalism in it. There's a lot of gods talking to Buddha. There's a lot of very extraordinary claims, being able to, travel and walk through walls and all this other, very supernaturalist stuff.
There's a lot of good magic in there.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good way of putting it. There's some good magic. And we can look at those things and, take them now as metaphors and similes and things like that. But they were actually believed by the early Buddhists.
So what would you recommend to those who are curious about secular Buddhism? What would you say to them in person?
I would say to concentrate on practicing mindfulness, being in the moment, because to me, the great thing about Buddhism is not the teachings, it's the practice. Now, you need teachings on how to practice, and those are appropriate and great. And there's mindfulness-based stress reduction. Many of the cognitive behavioral therapy schools now are incorporating mindfulness. Jack Kornfield does a great thing on mindfulness. I would say that the best entrance into Buddhism is through the practice of meditation, whether it's, for some people, really have a hard time actually sitting down, being still, and following their breath. So for some, the best doorway in is actually loving kindness meditation. That's sometimes the easiest for people because a lot of us grow up I had a childhood that wasn't necessarily very good. And one of the things we need to do is learn to accept ourselves. And in accepting ourselves, then we begin to accept reality and accept others. And we begin growing that loving kindness towards those that are near us, those that are a little further, stranger, and then hopefully be able to moderate some of our frustration towards those that maybe weren't so nice to us. And so that's, I think, the best way for someone interested in secular Buddhism is first get into the practice of meditation, whether loving kindness or mindfulness meditation. And then look at if you decide to read the Pali Canon, look at it as metaphor, but understand that the metaphor was probably taken literally by those early teachers, and realize too that the scripture which Buddhists value, the Pali Canon, was actually a compilation of 500 years of oral tradition, and some of that stuff may not be true. It's sometimes hard to get back to the historical Buddha. It's kind of similar to the problem with finding the historical Jesus. And you can get lost trying to find the historical Buddha. And I don't suggest that, because ultimately, whether the Buddha existed or didn't exist doesn't matter so much as, does the practice work?
Totally with you. Yep.
Does it eliminate or lessen suffering? And for me, I've kind of evolved my understanding of, in Buddhism, you try to get nirvana. Nirvana is, my understanding of it is psychological nirvana, which means freedom from suffering, not necessarily an otherworldly thing. But I've even taken a step back from that and said, the ultimate goal for me is to find tranquility. And that's the goal in Taoism and Stoicism, is tranquility, peace of mind. You know, you might not be able to eliminate all suffering, but you can find peace of mind in the midst of suffering. You can find tranquility in the midst of suffering. And that, to me, is the goal of meditation practice, of trying to be mindful of what you do, what you say, your movements. And that makes a big difference in your life, in the way that you treat other people. And that ultimately is what I believe the Buddha really wanted. Is he didn't want to make Buddhists. He wasn't a Buddhist. He wanted to make Buddhas, enlightened people who walk with compassion. It's kind of like the Dalai Lama said, my religion is kindness. And that, to me, is the goal, to be kind to one another, but also to be kind to yourself. I think we forget that kindness to ourselves. We start with that kindness to ourselves and radiate that kindness out. And we do that by the meditation practice, because it actually does change us. Loving kindness meditation, even though at first it seemed kind of odd, but as you begin to do it, you actually do feel yourself warming to people, and warming to people that maybe you would never even bother to give a second glance to. It changes your relationship to them, and it changes your relationship to life. And ultimately, you find out that pursuing happiness, you'll never get happiness. But making others happy, for some reason, makes you happy. It's an amazing paradox there.
Jay, what are some other things that you're working on?
Well, right now, I've been doing the Jay Forrest show, in which I interview people. And that's more of an intellectual conversation. We talk about concepts and ideas and stuff. And I'm right now in the midst of developing a second podcast called The School of the Way, in which we talk about the way. That is, it's just me sitting beside a stream, so you'll hear some water in the background, some birds chirping and stuff, where I just talk about, how do you do this thing called living mindfully? I mean, it's easy to talk conceptually about it, but how does it actually work in everyday life? What do you do when such and such happens? And so I want to talk about those things and get to more the practical aspects, the more into the details of the struggles and actually answer people's questions about meditation, life, relationships, love, fear, all those things that trip us up and kind of block us from finding that peace of mind, that tranquility.
Eager to hear more about that. And for those who are listening, if you'd like to find out more about Jay and his work, be sure to go to his website, jforrest.org. Jay, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Ted. I enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.